Hello, my name is Seun Matiluko, and I am the founder of the Oxford Law Black Alumni Network, otherwise known as the OLBA Network, which continues to grow from strength to strength. I'm here today to share with you a conversation I had with Professor Henry Louis Gates Jr. in late 2022 as part of the OLBA Network's Changemakers series. Professor Henry Louis Gates Jr. is the director of the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research and the Alphonse Fletcher University Professor at Harvard University. Alongside his academic work, the Emmy and Peabody Award winner has produced and hosted numerous films and television shows, including the 2022 4-episode series Making Black America, and, perhaps most famously, Finding Your Roots, a series that has been airing on PBS since 2012, where he guides public figures through their ancestry. I first met Professor Gates while a graduate student at Harvard University, where I took his graduate seminar on the New Negro Renaissance. I'm delighted to share our conversation with you. Okay, so Professor Gates, if this is not too wide a question, I'm wondering how you entered academia. Did you know from a young age that you always wanted to be a professor, or is this a gradual process that you found yourself in the position you are in now?
Well, at the age of 72, I'm astonished that I'm a professor and have been teaching in a university since the age of 26. This was not in the game plan. If you ask my mother, God rest her soul, I was put on this earth to be a medical doctor. From my mother and father had two sons, my older brother, Paul, and he stuck to the script. He went to dental school and became an oral surgeon, and in fact was the chief of dentistry at Bronx Lebanon Hospital in New York for donkey years, and was even acting dean of a dental school. A third generation in my extended Gates family. I have a great uncle who was a dentist. His son, my father's first cousin, was a dentist, and my brother went to dental school. So that's three generations. Me, I was going to be a medical doctor. You know, for Christmas and birthday, I'd get dissecting kits, stethoscopes, all that stuff. It's just the way it was. Smart little color boys and color girls, as they would have put it back in the day for our generation, were meant to be doctors. A medical doctor, for my mother in heaven, the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost, and the medical doctor. A medical doctor was the summa of the embodiment of intellect, the summa in terms of academic achievement. And I think that was true not only in the United States, but for many of my friends on the African continent, even one of my two best friends is Kwame Appiah. He was at Clare to read medicine, and he read medicine. It was a disaster his first year, and he switched, thank God, to philosophy. And his experience, in retrospect, was pivotal to mine, because it was at a dinner in October of 1973, 49 years ago, that visiting fellow Wole Soyinka, who was in self-imposed exile from Nigeria after he had been released from imprisonment during the Biafran War, the Nigerian Civil War, and had published his prison memoirs. The man died, so the government was trying to kill him all over again. He found refuge at Cambridge. Just by accident, Sean, I was at Clare College on a Mellon Fellowship from Yale. All Mellons go to Clare. Okay. And Anthony Appiah had been there for a year. And Wole Soyinka, because of his prison memoir, what needed to be out of Nigeria, found a position at Churchill College at Cambridge. And we all happened to meet. I mean, it's one of the most curious cases of serendipity that I could imagine. And at that dinner, they both said to me, look, anybody can be a doctor. I mean, I don't want my medical doctor friends to take this literally, but they said, basically, many are called, but few are chosen to be a professor. Mm-hmm. And I realized in that environment of Cambridge and through my day-to-day contact with Soyinka and Appiah, that all along, what I wanted to do was to be a professor. I wanted somebody to pay me to talk to brilliant students like you each week and read your papers and read books and write books. That was my fantasy. But it took a 3,000-mile trip away from home to find my my true calling. And it was a long time before I decided that this wasn't just a pastime. Most Americans who go to Oxbridge are affiliated students. It's called a Cambridge. I'm not sure what it's called at Oxford, but they enroll in a second BA, and they get that in 2 years, which then automatically, as you know, turns into an MA after 5 years. And then they all come back and pretend that they've gone to graduate school, and, you know, when they haven't.
Yeah.
And that's what my intention was, to read English or philosophy or art history. And I quickly settled on English. And then take pre-med courses in supervisions or tutorials, which I did. I did chemistry and biology and started one in physics before I came home. And then I was going to get this degree, a BA and then an MA, you know, Oxbridge, in English, and then come back and go to med school or law school, but preferably medical school. I took a test called, it was a famous test that all juniors, I believe, in America in my generation took, called the Cooter Preference Test. And it was created by the, I believe, the psychology department at Stanford. And it's the best test you can ever take because you can't fail. It just tells you who you are, you know, what you want to be and what you don't want to be. And I'll never forget, Seun, my two choices of occupation were psychiatry and law, which was true. Mm-hmm. And the two least favorite things for me were coal mining and police work. And that, the four of those, home run, absolutely correct. So I didn't want to be in the operating room and, you know, that kind of doctor, or certainly not a general practitioner. Mm-hmm. But going to medical school and then being a psychiatrist appealed to me. And in retrospect, if you think about it, as you know from the readings that we do from Freud that come to bear on literary analysis, being a psychiatrist is about telling stories, listening to people tell stories, and then decoding those stories for their figurative meaning, and or decoding their figurative meaning. So it's very much like a literary critic to that extent. So I have to thank the great Wally Soyinka and the brilliant Anthony Appiah. And the height of my academic career was on June 22nd of this year, when the University of Cambridge honored the three of us with honorary degrees because of that friendship and because of our individual attainments, of course. That was very special. It doesn't get more special than that. It took a long time for me to tell my parents, and my mother said, after a pause, she said, "Well, you're still a doctor."
You got there.
But it's what I'm meant to be, as you can see. Even if you didn't agree with all my crazy interpretations, I love what I do. I love the Black tradition, you know, and I learned things. I mean, you taught me something, which is, I had never, ever counted the number of times Marcus Garvey used the phrase, the new Negro. He used it more than Alain Locke did.
Yeah, 547.
Yeah, 500, how many?
547 times.
Yeah, 547 times. That's astonishing. And I started that work, as I told your class, and as I've written, when I was a sophomore. I took a seminar, a graduate seminar that I wormed my way into as a second year undergraduate. And I was struck by the arbitrary nature of this phrase, the new Negro. Well, what is an old Negro? And is that a good thing? Well, it connotes shame. To have to declare yourself a new Negro means there's something wrong with the old Negro. And where did this bizarre idea come from? Well, Alain Locke, bless his soul, claimed that he coined it when he most certainly didn't, as we know. And every year, almost, Martha Patterson, a colleague with whom I'm working on this big database, finds another example. But we now know it goes back to 1884, 1885. And we also know that there were half a dozen different iterations of the concept, diametrically opposed ideologically to each other, like Marcus Garvey's definition as opposed to Alain Locke. You can't get two more diametrically opposed definitions of the new Negro than that. But that kind of stuff turns me on. It exhilarates me. My vocation, as the saying goes, is my avocation. And I'm just deeply, deeply appreciative that A, I got a fellowship to go to Cambridge, and that B, the good Lord put me in touch with two absolute geniuses who changed the direction of my life. They saved me.
They saved you. Well, there's so much that you said that resonated with me, even the idea that you started teaching when you're 26, because I just turned 26 and I feel like I'm kind of at a crossroads in my life. Indeed, my parents perhaps share the same mentality that your mother had, and that they think that the only options are being a doctor, a lawyer, or a disappointment. And I am trying to figure my way.
Well, for my father, it was the law. So you've got it all covered.
Yeah.
And my brother said to me, my brother and the oldest cousin in my mother's family, the Coleman family, took me, when I came back from England, they took me out for a beer on a Saturday night at the bowling alley, our big hangout in Kaiser, West Virginia, the county seat. And after we had poured the beers, they said, we brought you here to talk some sense into you. Said, you're Harvard material. You go to Harvard Medical School. You can read novels on the weekend. And then my brother said, I've known you for 25 years and you want to be rich, which was true. I wanted to be comfortable. Yeah. I didn't want my children to be on scholarship, and that's nothing wrong with that. And I decided, I even went to law school for a month, Yale Law School. I applied to Harvard and Yale School, to the Harvard and Yale schools of law. Mm-hmm. When I was at Cambridge, I got into both. I went back to New Haven, thank God. But I went to the Yale Law School for 1 month, and I knew it just wasn't for me. It just wasn't going to work out. And I felt ashamed that I had been a coward because I was afraid that Cambridge was going to turn down my thesis. I'd had so many battles with them about the topic, and I wanted to write about African literature, African American literature. No. So by fits and starts, at the beginning, I was trying to trace this idea that James Weldon Johnson expressed in the first preface to the Book of American Negro Poetry, as you will recall, that no people who's ever been considered great, no people who has produced great literature and art has ever been regarded as distinctly inferior. So where did that idea come from? And he repeats it over and over again. Well, I began to research that and eventually traced it back to the Enlightenment, mm-hmm. which is where all my classes start, with the relation among race, writing, and reason, right, and the African's place on the great chain of being. But I had that insight that interest. I was intrigued by this relationship from the time I was 19 years old. As a sophomore, I wrote a paper about it. But I hesitate. I never want to go back and look at the quality of that paper. But I got an A, and I have been pursuing that idea since I was 19 years old, and I'm 72 now. So go figure, right?
Can I ask what happened when you were 19? Did you have a particularly dynamic teacher that put you on that track to start thinking about these things? Or
well, when I went to Yale, it was like opening a door onto a world of wonder. On the first day, I looked at the cathedral on campus, a grand neo-Gothic building. And I said to a friend, what denomination is that? And he goes, that's the library, idiot. So it was the metaphorical cathedral of learning.
Right.
And I walked into Sterling Memorial Library, and there were just acres of card catalogs, it seemed. And then I went to the Beinecke Rare Book Library where they had the James Weldon Johnson papers, Langston Hughes papers, the original recordings for the Bessie Smith story from Columbia Records. Man, I was like a kid in a candy store. And so I threw myself into all the classes that I took. And I'd given myself some space because I told my parents when I left, as I was leaving, that Yale was very, very rigorous. And if I got all C's, I actually believe this, that would be good because a C was the equivalent of an A in a normal place, right? And my father looked at me and he's a long time. He said, "Boy, you think I'm stupid?" He said, "Just go up there and do as well as you can. And if they don't treat you right, come on home." I'll never forget that. I got tears in my eyes when he told me. And I went to Yale and I worked hard. The first Friday night, 9 o'clock, I was there reading and my phone rang. It was my brother from dental school. And he said, "How come you're not out on a date with friends or going to a movie?" I go, "Oh man, this is Yale." He goes, "Look, if you can't go out and have a good time, you're going to have a meltdown." And he said, "You don't deserve to be there. You need to transfer or come back home to West Virginia. So get out there." So after that, every weekend I went to movies. And my wife and I, before COVID, had a standing date Friday and Saturday going to the movies. And I get many of my best ideas in movies and I relax and I get popcorn. And, we decided we didn't want to die going to the movies. COVID wasn't worth that. And so I threw myself into biology and psychology. The first year, I took my first African-American history course.
Okay.
And Seun, I just imbibed every fact. I mean, it just stuck to me like being sprayed in a Nigerian wedding with Naira. I looked like a Naira fountain. Oh my God. It was like 100. Joel A. Rogers, the autodidact, published a book called 100 Amazing Facts About the Negro. And I just had 1,000 amazing facts. Every fact was new and exciting because we couldn't study what we called at that time Afro-American studies in high school. You kidding? Everything we learned about African and Black people, we called Negro Day, which was one session about slavery. It lasted about 5 minutes. And it said, the best thing ever happened to you people, meaning the few Black kids in my class, the teacher would point at us for slavery, because our ancestors were over there swinging through trees and naked and probably eating missionaries. And, with no civilization, no culture. And that they had been educated by what Booker T. Washington called the University of Slavery. And, it was horrible. I remember one time Mr. Baker, my civics teacher, said to the 3 Black guys in the class, "You boys, without Abraham Lincoln, you wouldn't be here." And man, we slept. Let the record show that Henry Louis Gates Jr. is slouching down in his chair even now, holding a textbook in front of his face. It was embarrassing, man.
Yeah.
And African-American African-American ideas about Africa, let's be honest, we're just as racist as the white people, because we got our source of the ideas was the same. That was Tarzan movies in Hollywood. You weren't studying about Africa, for Christ's sake, in a textbook. And we didn't know anything about it. People pretend that's not the case, but it was absolutely the case. And it took a long time for us to begin to be educated about Africa. The great year of independence, 1960, began to change that. Pioneering African-American intellectuals of a Pan-African bent like Maya Angelou, accepting Nkrumah's invitation to come back to Ghana and be citizens. That began to change it. But of course, the Black Power, Black Arts movement really began to change it in 1966, 1967. Then the birth of Black Studies in 1969 in the Academy. And then Roots in 1977. Roots still has a reverberating effect, as Americans know each week from my own TV series. The #1 nonfiction series on PBS is Finding Your Roots. I picked that title consciously as a riff on Roots because that, in my case, wasn't the birth of my interest in my own genealogy, but it certainly catapulted that interest that I had. And by 1977, I had lived in Africa for several months. After my sophomore year, I took a gap year on a program at Yale called 5-year BA.
Okay.
And I went to, I visited Ethiopia and Kenya, well, the airports. And then I lived in the village of Kilomatindi near Dodoma,
okay,
in central Tanzania, and worked in a mission hospital for August, September, October, November, December, just over 4 months probably. And then I hitchhiked with a white guy who's now a priest. Thank God, because nobody would believe me. I have a priest to verify this.
Okay.
I hitchhiked across the equator from Dar es Salaam to Mombasa to Nairobi, to Kampala, to Kigali, to Goma and Lake Kivu in the Congo, to Kisangani, and then we sailed down the Congo River for 5 days, 6 days, to Kinshasa. So effectively, we had gone from the Indian Ocean almost to the Atlantic Ocean by land and water, which is amazing. And then I flew to Nigeria. I was in Nigeria before you were born, and stayed, a few days, and then culminated my Africa trip with a flight from Lagos to Accra to make a pilgrimage at Du Bois's grave. And I have a photograph in my office of Du Bois's original burial place, which is outside the castle, which is the site of the offices of the president. Now he has his own mausoleum, but I have one of the few photographs of that his original burying place. So I'd been to Africa. I'd seen Africa on the ground, more so than any other American that I'd ever met, any student certainly, than most adults. Because even academics would go and stay at the Hilton or something, it's like, but I hitchhiked across the continent, and I was very proud of that.
Didn't you say something about some of the locals describing you as a white person?
Oh, Mzungu,
Yeah.
Swahili for white man. I mean, it means stranger, literally, but it's the denotation is different than the connotation. It connotes white man. So yeah, they went like, no, you're not an African, you're an American. But I became an American when I set foot in London. When I got to London on the way to Africa, I flew from New York to London to Paris to Amsterdam to Rome to Athens to Tel Aviv to Addis Ababa to Nairobi and then to Dar over, a month and a half. And that was an amazing trip. I turned 20 in the village of Kilomatindi. So I'd seen all these places that I'd been fascinated by since I was in elementary school, really. I'd climbed the Parthenon, I'd been to the Holy Land, I'd been to the Colosseum, I'd been to the Louvre, I'd seen the Mona Lisa and the Sistine Chapel, that's what I'm talking about. And, but I had a fascination with Africa since I was 10 years old. And no one knows where this came from because nobody in my family cared anything about Africa, and no one in my school, nothing, and I was always a race man. I mean, I was always interested in Black people on TV, the few Black people you ever saw. I was starving for facts about the Black experience and Black history. So, but I don't know where that came from. I have no idea why that emerged, but it did.
Well, with that being the case, I would love to pick back up on your long-lasting friendship with Kwame Anthony Appiah and Wole Soyinka. And I say that in part because we first met through your class on the New Negro Renaissance or the Harlem Renaissance. And we read some of the writings of Alain Locke. And famously, Alain Locke, when he came to Oxford, he was very vocal about the fact that it was enlightening to him to meet people from across the African diaspora. And And I wonder, when you came to Cambridge as a young African-American man interacting with Kwame Anthony Appiah, someone British with Ghanaian heritage, and also Wole Soyinka from Nigeria, did that impact your view of yourself or your race, as it were, in the world?
Oh, absolutely. The first Africans I met were at Yale as an undergraduate.
Okay.
I had a few friends who were from the African continent. And then I took the year off and I went to Africa and did that amazing trip. So when I came back, I was a junior. And by that time, I had under my belt an enormous amount of experience with Africa and Africans, right?
Yeah.
But when I went to Cambridge, it was of different order. Well, at Yale, I became very good friends with Ethelbert Cooper, who's a dear friend of mine, and he gave us the funds for the Cooper Gallery. And I tapped him for my secret society, book and snake, meaning when he basically replaced me, filled my seat. And Bert is a Liberian, an Afro-Liberian, I forget what they call them.
Americo-Liberian?
Yeah, thank you. Americo-Liberian, yeah. And his family left Virginia to return to Africa in the 1820s, I believe. His cousin, Helen Cooper, or Helene Cooper, you have to fact check that, wrote a book about their family. And so they have a very, very well documented family history. But when I got to Cambridge, it was Anthony, whose uncle was the Asantehene, the king of the Asante. Ronnie Mutebi, who is now the Kabaka, the king of the Buganda. We ran around together.
I see.
There was a Nigerian, O.A. Ladameji, who was very brilliant, who was reading philosophy. There were three of us who were Black in Clare College. And Soyinka was giving a public lecture series, and all of us sat in there. So there was an African Student Union. So I would see these guys at parties and, whatever. Man, I was scrambling just to learn how to do close reading, so I spent a lot of time just studying, trying to be a good citizen of literature. But I developed deep and abiding friendships with brilliant young scholars from the African continent who remain some of my very best friends. One of the reasons that I've always felt comfortable being truthful about the good and bad things in the African past, namely the role of African elites in the slave trade, is because of the intimacy in my friendships. Look, I paid my dues. I was not just a voyeur showing up at a 5-star hotel, staying for a week, and then coming back and writing a book about Africa. I had lots of deep and abiding friendships, lots of experience on the ground, in the bush. The village where I lived, all the Africans lived in, mud houses and had no electricity, no running water. I was living with half a dozen European missionaries who were medics, and we had a generator, so we had electricity, and we had a borehole with a pump, so I could bathe with hot water. But it was as far from
city life, urban life.
Yeah, from Yale University as you could get, from the neo-Gothic structures of Mother Yale that one could get. And so I didn't think that I had to pretend, and I didn't have to ask anybody for permission. And so when I made this, the most controversial thing in my life was my series, Wonders of the African World, when I talked openly about the African role in the slave trade. That was the first big internet conflagration, with the whole Black establishment ganged up against me for either lying by exaggerating the role of African elites in the slave trade, or disclosing a family secret that nobody was ever supposed to talk about, and both of which were total rubbish. Everybody knew. If you look at my book, Wonders of the African World, I lined up quotes from people, from Frederick Douglass and other 19th century Black abolitionists, through Du Bois, about everybody knew about the African role in the slave trade. But somehow that had been elided after the Black Power, Black Arts movement, when this was an inconvenient truth.
Mhm.
And I just confronted it squarely. Now you can take it for granted. I was worried. We went to see Woman King.
Yeah, that controversies come up again with that film and the presentation of the Dahomey Empire in an anti-slavery stance.
And friends and I had an argument about this. And well, it's a feature film. As a would-be filmmaker myself, I give people license. But I would have felt better if they'd had a card at the beginning to explain, and at the end, maybe to explain the subtlety and say, they can't say, well, we've taken liberties, blah, blah, blah. But they could say slavery continued in the kingdom of Dahomey till the king died or the British intervened. However, there was a debate between the king's brothers. That would have been nice. And what would have that would have cost them? You know, it wouldn't have cost them anything. But they didn't. If I had been an advisor,
Mm-hmm.
I would have said, you can't say that, you know, they demonized the Yoruba. They were the big, bad, evil guys. And played, you know, that wasn't real history. But you're not supposed to go to Hollywood to get your history anyway. So it's complicated.
It is complicated. And I'm sort of wondering, because we're talking about media, and I'm wondering, because there's a point in your career while you're still teaching, you're still in academia, but there's a point in your career where you go further into media. I think your first credit is in 1994, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, 1994. Yeah. And I co-founded theroot.com.
Right.
So, and Anthony Appi and I did Encarta Africana in 1999, and we started a .com, which we sold, africana.com. So you could see that, look, I love stories. I inherited a love of stories from my father and mother. Mm-hmm. My father was one of the master storytellers of all time. Funny. My father made Red Fox look like an Undertaker. You know, he was hilarious. And naturally, you know, just wittily. Double entendres. My mother's nickname was Pun because of her commander language.
I see.
My mother used to write the obituaries for all the Black people in the Potomac Valley and then read them at the funeral service and then publish them in the newspaper. So she was my first Black. She was the beginning. It wasn't Phyllis Wheatley. It was Pauline Augusta Coleman Gates was the mother of the African-American women's writers tradition as far as my household was concerned. I love stories. Yeah. So the point is, early on, even as an undergraduate, I became painfully aware of the fact there are people who are doomed to recreate the wheel, reinvent the wheel every generation.
Because it gets lost or forgotten.
No memory, no passed on memory. Mm-hmm. And that you can't build a field if every generation has to create the first encyclopedia, the first dictionary, the first concordance, whatever. There's no memory. And as a new student of English literature, you know, I could go to the library and find out exactly how many times Shakespeare uses the word house or horse because people had counted them.
Yeah.
That's just one tiny example. Biographical dictionaries galore. You know, dictionaries of the English language, the OED, drawing on Samuel Johnson's dictionary of 1755. Every possible concordances, bibliographies, annotated bibliography. We didn't have any of that stuff. And so I wanted, once I was committed to this field, and through the influence of a great historian, John Blaskine, it was very much about primary resources and consolidating data. I wanted to spread the word about the Black experience through as many different kinds of media as I could. And as it turned out, I've been able to do that. And that's, I'm in Los Angeles now filming a new 5 new guests for the new season of Finding Your Roots. I love it. But I don't like it more than teaching 16 brilliant graduate students like you once a week in a class. But I wouldn't want only to be that kind of academic. I want to have this multi-tiered life.